In April 2022, the Netflix series Heartstopper was released to widespread acclaim. It primarily follows a budding friendship turned love story between two British teenage boys at a single-sex grammar school. They are Nick and Charlie, played by Kit Connor and Joe Lott, and the series, directed by Eros Lim, is based on a popular webcomic and series of graphic novels of the same name. They were created by acclaimed author, illustrator, and now screenwriter Alice Oseman. Since the show's release, the Heartstopper fandom has exploded, with so many people finding comfort in the story's depiction of the young British queer experience. I'm Natalie Townsend, and I'm a BFI Film Academy Young Programmer. I'm in charge of this LFF for free event, which we are calling Heartstopped. This project is a collection of interviews through which we will explore how Heartstopper came to be the success it is. Through this lens, we can then discuss greater themes on queer representation, fandom, and independent storytelling. Thank you so much for joining me today, and let's get into the event.
So I first discovered Heartstopper when it was self-published by Alice Oseman through a Kickstarter campaign. I went to Alice's website and I ordered a copy of the Kickstarter-backed, self-published version of Volume 1, and I read it. I think I'd read it a bit online before then already because Alice puts it, the webcomic, lives there too. So it was such an easy and beautiful story to dive into, and I just completely fell for the way she drew the characters, the will they won't they romance between Nick and Charlie, and the sense of romance and excitement was just really thrilling, and it felt like something I hadn't experienced before with characters of that age.
So Heartstopper as a webcomic, I was familiar with it because back in the day I was chronically online, but in a different way on Tumblr, and it would always kind of crop up every now and then amongst, as the algorithm kind of, views stuff on your feed. I remember when I saw kind of like murmurs of this project coming through, there was talk about it, and to the point that when the trailer dropped, I was like, I know this, I recognize this, and it was nice to see the correlation between something that had been birthed to an extent online, now kind of like going through this trajectory almost to getting a space on this massive global platform.
And I felt completely transported to my own teenage years, to the time where I fell in love for the first time. And I didn't fall in love until I was in my 20s properly with a man. So reliving that through the prism of these characters was really transportative. I really felt like I was in another world, which for me is one of the most exciting things about filmmaking, is that you can step in the shoes of somebody else for the duration of that film or that TV show.
When I first read Heartstopper, I really responded to Charlie Spring because I just felt there was some essence of me at that age in that character, and I'm sure loads of people do. It's not unique to my experience, but he had such a kind of wore his heart on his sleeve. You could read his anxieties in the way Alice had drawn him. He was openly gay, but sort of struggling to deal with all of the issues around coming out at school. So specific, such a sweet character that I just felt, I want to see his journey on screen. Like there's more to be had here, and so it became then a kind of real mission for me to meet Alice, to pitch to her to come and adapt the comic into a television series with Seesaw. And yeah, it was the start of a really great creative journey for both of us.
I don't think I was driven by lack or an absence. I think I was driven by a desire to experience vicariously what Charlie and Nick have for one another, or what they have with their friendship group, or the relationships they have with their parents and the world, and that confidence that they had in their sexuality and their discovery of sexuality, and their confidence as they take the steps to come out and define themselves and define their sexuality, was something that I, growing up in the 1980s, didn't have. It was a very different environment, a very hostile environment. And that's not to say that there aren't hostilities now, but it felt, this piece felt incredibly liberated and felt very, it felt revolutionary in a way because of the purity of the love story it was telling. And I think the strength of my feelings towards it when I first read the scripts and then later the graphic novels, I think is the thing that really drove me to want to be part of it.
I think that it kind of all boils down to the idea of creating for the sake of creating, which fandom and fan fiction operate on a gift economy, which means that rather than doing something for monetary gain or because you expect something in return, you do it just to do it. And then maybe somewhere down the road, you get some sort of return from that. So it's like, if I write this story or if I create this piece of fan art, if I put a lot of time and effort into this thing because I want to create it, maybe somebody will leave a nice comment and say that they like it, or they will just share this with their friends or anything like that. And I think that that's really important, because when you do things just because you love them, the passion in them is very evident.
When things come from independent minds or kind of self-published communities, naturally there's a lot of care and there's a lot of thought that's gone into these. And I think one of the things we always need to recognize is the fact that it's a person probably doing this as a side project. So it's someone doing this as a passion project that's fully committed to this, but may not necessarily have the resources or, all the traditional kind of education around it to kind of put this project together. But instead, what pushes it is the community and the creators. And I think, because of that, there's that independent frame of thought, but also direction. So there's more creative control of how many LGBTQ characters get to be in there, and there's no kind of debate as to whether this will fit or will it affect ratings or will it affect the specific opinion of an audience. Instead, it's kind of the creator and the community feeding the input and to an extent the direction of this.
I think if as a filmmaker that you're constantly thinking about what the audience is thinking, I don't think it leads to making the best work. I think as a filmmaker, you have to tell the story that's in your heart, and the minute that you're creating, that you're thinking about, oh, what will the audience think of this, what will the audience think of that, you're telling the story from what you think somebody else thinks about it, and I think that way disaster lies.
I think the intent of the output kind of differs slightly, because independent creators will, I think, want to play homage as much as possible to the queer characters, the narrative storytelling. And I think there's a risk with mainstream content and stories that they may to some extent have to fulfill kind of familiar plot lines and storylines, and may not have as much kind of creative freedom to be as experimental as you want. Everything
that's in the TV show has the rubber stamp of approval from Alice herself, because they're there and they're involved in the making of it. It's not always the way. That doesn't usually happen. Sometimes, what you would mainly do is go to a screenwriter to adapt an author's work. But I think in this case, it really helped build the kind of tone and feeling of the show in a way that really matches the experience of reading the webcomic and the graphic novel.
But for me, Heartstopper, I think, was this brilliant story between these two characters that had this cult community following from the beginning, because it was a webcomic, and then to see it translated on the small screen but in such a global way, I think was brilliant. And it had not only its original audience, and its newly acquired audience, a much younger demographic as well, I thought was brilliant.
I think it really encourages others that that's something that they too can do, because I know there are like tons of young folks all over the place who their dream is to be a writer or an artist or a creator of some capacity, and frequently the sensible adults are like, well, that's not you know, a reasonable or feasible thing. You need to pick like something that's practical. But seeing the impact and the power that fandom and fan fiction have like in these kinds of spaces can like encourage them to pursue their passions regardless of what, you know, the sensible adults in their life have to say.
And that in itself, I think, is an achievement, because a lot of self-published kind of, whether it's pieces of art or narratives or stories in itself, you know, you kind of think they're almost relegated to this online community. And I think instead it should not only the hope but the scope for something to kind of reach further than you imagined. And Heartstopper's done incredible things, and for it to be known and recognized as a webcomic or a webtoon, however people want to kind of refer to it as, I think pays great credit to kind of its origin and what can come from those kind of communities.
There is much to be said for the power of self-publishing, social media, and independent storytelling. The fact that Heartstopper has these origins goes to show that new voices can be heard. The show isn't alone in being adapted from webcomics either. There are plenty of K-dramas that have come from Korean webcomics, as well as a few animated series. These revolutionary stories are out there available for free, and I urge you to go find them. And if you are an artist or a writer or both who is creating these narratives, then know that your voice is heard, and know that your stories matter. I hope you keep creating them.
Reviews have all centred around similar words: likeable, endearing, wholesome, earnest. It's an anti-cynical show in its approach. You have to dive in and embrace it like a kid who's too young to have been sucked into the shame-driven idea of cringe.
It has a way of encompassing so many characters and so many things going on while also maintaining a story that is understandable, well-paced, and thorough in its job of understanding the nuances that the problems that it addresses.
The soundtrack is phenomenal. The way that actors brought the characters to life, the way that editing and everything was done, insane, incredible, beautiful.
It's a good, fun show that has no shame about being openly and explicitly queer, but it still portrays the ugliness that can come with being openly queer in a modern day high school.
Alice writes from a place of understanding that experience, but also with the intention of creating a show and series that showcases a bunch of queer characters that we as an audience can relate to. I feel like we really underestimate how different this show could have been if it put all its focus onto intensely negative parts of being queer.
What strikes me most about Heartstopper is just how normal it is. It's the kind of slightly cheesy love story that straight people have been getting since cinema began.
Heartstopper presents an idealized, joyous depiction of queer teens. And not just any queer teens, but a spectrum of queer teens.
It's wholesome. Like, it's just very wholesome. Like, it's not overly sexual at all, like a lot of coming of age shows are nowadays, like drama coming of age shows. It really just is a feel-good show, and I feel good because of it. Like, when I ended the show, I was like happy. I had a smile on my face. I was like, oh, yes.
I think of myself as part of this fan base, because when I first read Heartstopper, I was like, this is great. And, you know, I would do things like order pins off Alice's website that they would send out, and you know, I've got like little prints of Nick and Charlie that I put up where I live, and it's just a happy, beautiful, tender love story that people love to feel close to, I think. So you read it and you have all of the kind of thrill of reading it for the first time or watching the TV series for the first time, but then you want to go back and enjoy it again and again because there's something kind and tender and loving at its core, and I think people get a lot of comfort from that, and I certainly resonate with that as the experience of being a fan of Heartstopper.
Fan fiction just as a whole is really accessible for storytelling, and it fosters a sense of community. And when you are othered from society, which a lot of people who are active in these online fandom spaces are for one reason or another, finding this community. I know for me personally, I got bullied a lot in school, but knowing that when I got home, I had a laptop full of people who actually cared about me for me, and these were people that I had met in fandom spaces, that, like, looking back now, I can see how absolutely vital and important that was for me. Because I don't think that, like, I would have been able to make it as far as I have if it wasn't for those people.
Content that exists online, generally, it has a huge reach, and younger demographics or older demographics are able to access it. And I think that's one of the key things. Audiences should be able to directly have a link to it, whether, you know, it's online, whether it's on a specific forum, whether it's just a chat room, etc., or somebody kind of creating content and it's existing on a platform like Tumblr or Twitter or TikTok. And I think these spaces can kind of birth narratives that we aren't even necessarily aware of, that can, you know, build into TV shows down the line, or it can lead to being a comic series or even self-published things. So there's a reason stuff like fanfic even is so popular and continues to be, is because there's cult communities, whether it's LGBTQ stuff or not, that continue to feed into this space because they feel like they're represented or they're seen, or, you know, giving a platform to marginalized voices that don't necessarily get the opportunity to be heard on the mainstream screen. And so people, whatever community you belong to, will always seek for that voice in that space.
Fan fiction is an accessible means of storytelling. And when I say that, what I mean is that, for one, it exists largely free and online. So you don't have like an economic barrier standing between you and those stories. And storytelling is a pillar of society. It's a pillar of community and of just humanity in general, because humans need community. And so when you remove those barriers to gain access to these stories, you get like a really like just wonderful community surrounding it. And so it's accessible in the fact that it is free and online, and it is accessible in that you get a wealth of representation and diversity and inclusion that you haven't traditionally found in traditionally published media. And when it came to like not being a queer tragedy, where you don't have like the bury your gays trope or queer baiting or anything like that. And so that kind of accessibility is really, really important.
I think Heartstopper was quite unique in terms of the audience it attracted. It was a very young audience who were very familiar with social media and also very familiar with kind of like webcomics or webtoons. And so it kind of birthed this whole new era of fandom. It was not only like intensely dedicated to any kind of media output, whether, you know, it was edits or photos or kind of magazine interviews, but it was also really joyous. Quite easy to celebrate something like that. We all need something that's quite uplifting and light.
For me, as the director, I felt very free to interpret and represent the graphic novels as I felt fit. But of course, Alice's relationship with the fan base is very different and much more is much more of a two-way relationship. She has connections with the fans and they connect with her, although as the fan base grows, obviously that's harder for her to navigate.
I think it's difficult not to champion something like this when there's so much joy attached to it and so much creativity. You just kind of want to talk about it, and I think having queerness presented in such a positive way, in an accessible way, that's really important, and that feeds into fandom, and fandom feed back into that kind of ethos of like queer joy, and it's really important. So I think that's why it's stuck around so much.
That I think what it creates is a space and a community and an environment that people want to be in, and they want to celebrate Alice's work, and they want to feel close to the characters. So yeah, it's no surprise that the fan base has grown. From the first time I met Alice, it was growing even at that point, and it's just gone exponentially, obviously, through this process of making and releasing the television series. But it's no surprise to me, and I think it will keep going, because working on the TV series and watching all of the cuts of the episodes and being on set as they do take after take after take, usually that can be quite a grueling process on other series, but on this series, I've never found it boring once. I always have a smile on my face. It's just the loveliest, most beautiful world to be a part of, and it's such a privilege.
I mean, I guess it could have gone very much the other way if the loyal fans had hated it, which does happen. You know, you see lots of adaptation, you know, some adaptations, especially of existing IP, which is well loved, are made. The loyal fans reject it and the show dies a death or the film bombs. So I think that experience could have gone either way, and unfortunately it went the right way for us.
So I think when we're talking about queer media specifically, I think we have to consider the queer quote unquote sides of social media. So for the case of like TikTok and Twitter, these are contemporary spaces that, social media is relatively new, but these are incredibly new. And there's besides branded quote unquote queer talk and stuff like that, where, edits and so on will kind of exist in these spaces for these communities. And I think social media has this kind of common denominator of community accessibility and shareability. Heartstopper went from beginning to absolute end to this, small little webtoon that people knew and loved, to this massive global project that was literally everywhere. It was on the front of magazines, it was on posters, it was on billboards, everybody knew about it, and they still know about it, and now there's the second season coming. So I think, you shouldn't discredit fandom, you shouldn't underestimate fandom, and I think, some really incredible stories can come from it.
With how much the industry has changed in recent years, especially regarding queer representation, it's no surprise that Heartstopper isn't the only coming-of-age show that depicts the queer experience. Nor is it the only show that understands the importance of own voices both in front of and behind the camera, as well as fully rounded characters that exist both with and beyond their own identities.
When you're telling a story that is an LGBTQ+ story about young people, it's really vital to make sure that everyone involved understands what the mission is. And I think we did that as a creative team. I would say the creative team of myself, Alice as the screenwriter and creator, and our brilliant director, Eros Lynn, went about that by going, okay, well, we're all LGBTQ+. How can we assemble as many people around us in the telling of this story who are also from that community? And once you sort of put yourself in that position and you go, this is what we are and why we're telling this story because it really matters to us, you then find a group of people to come and share that with.
The first thing that unlocked everything was the casting, and we made a choice very early on that we wanted to cast actors who are in their teens as close as possible to the actual age of the characters to play these parts, which is difficult to do because those actors have usually never acted for screen before. Getting to them is very difficult, or has been historically very difficult. We got about 10,000 applicants, people who sent in their audition tapes, and we whittled those down to a core shortlist of about 30 actors, recalled those, and eventually figured out who the pairings would be, and took what at the time felt like a really big risk, and now in retrospect it feels like it was a really easy choice because we had this amazing smorgasbord of talent in front of us. But I think the virtue of having done that was that we brought a real sense of authenticity to the representation of those characters. Also having, making it very clear when we advertised the roles that we were very keen to reach members of the queer community, people who identified as the characters identify themselves to audition, and I think that definitely brings another degree of authenticity to the representation.
And the two leading actors, they kind of embody this spirit of just individuality and kind of leans into this queerness in such an authentic and sincere way. And I think across the interviews, across the show itself, everything was as sincere and kind of as heartfelt as possible. So yeah, I thought it was brilliant.
Queer representation feels like we're at a turning point, I think, certainly in terms of film and television. I've been developing TV series and working on films and stuff for over 10 years. And, back then, when I was first starting out, you wouldn't take on more than one project that was like specifically gay or specifically LGBT in some way, because it was just presumed by everyone that it would be incredibly difficult to get those more than one story away, you know, within a year. So it was a mentality of, okay, well, you can have a queer as folk, and then you might have Russell Davis do something brilliant like Cucumber. You know, it wasn't like the sky's the limit. It was, there are a few revered LGBTQ plus screenwriters, and they get to tell their stories every so often. But in terms of, you know, something like Heartstopper, I wouldn't have felt that was possible 5 to 10 years ago, and that's really sad. And so it's worth celebrating the fact that now this show has happened, and other shows like it are happening as well.
I think a lot of people have centered on the positivity of the show as the thing that really you know, has made it unique. But I would argue that it's the purity of the love story that really has struck a nerve, and that wholesome goodness, that love or romance or even lust can hold.
And we're seeing a shift now where you get more of that kind of representation, especially queer representation, where, you know, it's not just, you know, trauma porn essentially, or bury your gays or queer baiting or anything like that. You get to see just queer people existing and being happy, and not, you know, being the butt of a joke or anything like that. And I think that that's going to be absolutely revolutionary for a whole new generation of queer people, because they're not going to have to fight and struggle as much when it comes to seeing themselves represented.
We as queer people have many stories to tell, and this is one of them. This is a largely positive story, largely not centered around transgression, and driven by romance and love, and something that can be carnal and pure. And I think it's you know, it's one of the exciting things about the show, that its positivity, and it is something that's intertwined with queerness.
Like I said, I think it's just like revolutionary that we have queer joy represented, as opposed to just you know, queer tragedy, because that's not realistic. And I know a lot of people use storytelling as escapism, but escapism can take many forms, and not everybody wants to use escapism via, you know, high fantasy. Some people want to read about ordinary people who are like them having ordinary lives, because maybe they're in a place like, you know, a high school kid who is having a terrible time because they're being bullied, you know, for a wide number of reasons, but maybe particularly their queerness. And they can look at these stories that have, you know, queer people who are normal like them, who aren't, you know, like supercharged with superpowers or anything like that. And they can look and see how they lead happy, healthy, normal lives. And it gives them something to look forward to. It gives them a reason to, you know, like wake up the next day, you know, a reason to be like, you know, I have to keep going because I can achieve this one day. And seeing that, as opposed to just seeing, you know, being the butt of a joke, or literally getting killed off in media. It's really, really important.
The universality of falling in love is something that is true for everyone, and is something that I wanted to try and speak to a much wider audience about that experience that they could empathize with. The essence of film and television and narrative art is about empathy, and creating an empathy with our audience. So our audience who haven't lived as queer people can also understand the humanity and those universal human experiences that our queer characters are experiencing. So it's a you know, it's those two things. You know, the more specific and true to the queer experience we can be, the more chance we're having of connecting with those universal human experiences of what it's like to be a human being.
It's a joyful story to adapt because it has a whole kind of, you know, plethora of characters that you don't necessarily see being given that treatment in other series. To have Charlie Spring openly gay from the very first frame or panel of the show comic is revolutionary, I think, for a character of that age. You know, he's going through something, obviously, but he is out and proud of who he is, and he knows who he is. And you don't often see gay love stories, especially not gay love stories with teenagers in them, where the sexuality isn't mined for a sense of, oh, they've got to keep a secret. There's got to be some element of shame or disguise in the story, and then there becomes a euphoric moment of coming out. Not with this, because Charlie Spring, he's already out. And Elle is already in the process of moving schools and has transitioned, and her trans identity is celebrated with love by her friends, but it isn't something that we ever want to kind of concern ourselves with as, you know, the primary focus of the show.
You know, as queer people, we're also, you know, we have multiple identities. Where I'm Welsh, I'm a son, I'm a husband, I'm queer. You know, we all carry multiple identities that kind of slot together and make us who we are. And I think one of the things that's exciting about Heartstopper is that lots of our characters are many things. They're not just one thing. And Elle is trans, and her trans experience defines her. But it's not the only thing that defines her. She's the new girl at school. She's trying to navigate friendship. And I think that's one of the things that the audience really loves about the show, and that I love about the show, is that you know, these are multiple dimensioned characters.
I think representation is super important, but it has to come with a sense of authenticity and excitement. You can't just be going, oh, this we're telling a story solely to represent a group of marginalized people, because no one wants to think of themselves in that way. They want to think of themselves as full, rounded, you know, nuanced, dynamic people, which we all are. And I think that's the approach Heartstopper takes, and that's why the representation within it doesn't feel like a chore. It doesn't feel like it's being rammed down anyone's throats. It's just, here's an amazing ensemble of queer characters. Aren't they all individual, brilliant, beautiful? Don't we love all of them, and don't we root for all of them? And that's a fun experience. And I think that you don't often see that.
To echo Eros, the essence of film and television is about empathy and universal human experiences. Like queer people, queer media is multidimensional. 2022 has seen a massive rise in the sheer range of queer teen experience represented on screen. Though tonally different to Heartstopper, empathy and authenticity are still staples of Amazon Freevee's new show, High School. We got to talk with writer and director Clea Duvall about the show, which screens as part of BFI London Film Festival.
High School is a television show based on a memoir written by Tegan and Sarah, who are musicians, twin sisters, and the story follows them on their journey towards their own sexuality, discovering their own sexuality, and finding who they are as artists. Something that I really wanted to explore was how what an internal process it is. And it, which seems like doesn't seem like it makes for good TV, but the actors that we found were just so incredible and did such a beautiful job, bringing their inner life to the screen. I have been friends with Tegan and Sarah for over 15 years now, and they sent me their book before it came out, and I read it in one night. I fell in love with it, and I felt so seen by it. It was the first time I had read a coming of age story that I really connected to perfectly. You know, I think, you know, as queer people, there are so few coming of age stories that, especially for girls, like it's, you know, you always kind of bend over backwards to fit yourself into a narrative to make yourself feel seen. But this was the first time where I was like, wow, yes, that was exactly it. And it was so powerful that even as like a woman in my 40s, feeling that kind of connection and that sense of being seen, it really had a big impact on me. And I thought, you know, I can't be the only person who feels this way. And it just felt like such a great opportunity to bring this story to life in a different way. It's humanizing, right? I mean, like as queer people, we can be so othered, and people can be so afraid of us for some reason, because for people who are not knowingly exposed to queer people, to see that we are still just people, you know, even though, you know, it's 2022, there are still so many, you know, countries and cities and states where being queer is something that is still shocking and upsetting or illegal, or, you know, in some places, or like grounds to kill someone. You know, it's still like a very real threat to people for some reason. I mean, it's changed a lot. Like I remember being an actor in the 90s, and if there was a show or a movie that had a gay character in it, it was such a big deal. Like it was such a novelty, and it was really, you know, and if you can believe it, I got offered a lot of gay parts. And some of them I did, and some of them I didn't, because at the time I was closeted, and that's just what you did. It wasn't sort of, you know, it wasn't a discussion. Everyone defaulted into the closet. So, you know, in the rare, at the rare time where you actually got a script that had a queer character in it, it was really like kind of shocking. And the team, you know, like my team would get kind of nervous and like, are we doing this, or what are you know, like, because it was very dangerous for me to do something like that, you know, to take on gay roles. And there were things that I didn't do that I wish I, like looking back, I'm like, why didn't I do that? Just because I was afraid. Like it's such a bummer, you know. But now, you know, it's really changed, and there are so many out actors, and it doesn't feel like career suicide to be out now, which is so amazing. And you know, the content that's being created there, you know, there are so many gay characters or queer characters and queer stories. It just doesn't feel like that big of a deal anymore. It's almost like weirder now when there isn't, you know, because there's been this sort of acceptance and acknowledgement of the existence of queer people, which I know seems crazy that it wasn't like that, but it really wasn't like that. And if it was just to sort of like, it was like the gay best friend in a romantic comedy, you know, or someone getting murdered for being gay. You know, there was not a lot of in between. It seemed like the girls that we found to play Tegan and Sarah, Rayleigh Gilliland and Season Gilliland, Rayleigh plays Tegan and Season plays Sarah. We found them on TikTok of all places. I'm still not 100% clear on even what TikTok is, but I know that that's where we found them. And they were non-actors. They were not trying to be actors. We basically just like knocked on their, like saw the Tegan, they showed up in Tegan's feed. It was just an algorithm that was like, hey, are you interested in twins? Here are some twins. And there was just something so undeniably like charismatic about them that we, you know, took this big leap in casting them, and they worked so hard and did such an amazing job. And it was like finding like two diamonds in the rough, you know. It was just like, it just seemed like impossible. And but they really just came in and really blew me away every single day. I mean, listen, I am not a big social media person. I am never really, I don't understand TikTok, and like I'm very, very rarely on Twitter or Instagram. So it does feel like sort of a foreign land to me. But I definitely think that it is, you know, the world is sort of evolving, and like in this way, and social media is, you know, it is a place for creative people to get themselves out there. And it's really exciting to see some of the people who have gotten their start through being on social media.
Historically, queer representation has been minimal, stereotypical, and generally negative, but Heartstopper is a landmark for queer rep, being such a diverse and heartfelt show from LGBT creatives and with such unconventional origins. We still have further to go, but it's clear that gone are the days from the Hays Code restricting even the implication that protagonists might be queer. So where are we going?
I've always been a bit of a cynic when it comes to queer representation, and I'm rooting for it as much as I can, but sometimes things can be pretty bleak on the front of representation. I think when you say representation, you have to be very considered in what it encapsulates. Yes, it includes people of color, it includes different sexualities and identities, different ages, different demographics in respect of where they come, not just a solely Western angle. There's so many nuances to it. But I think gradually, slowly but surely, things are getting there.
I think where it's going is, I think, like up, if that makes any sense. Like there's only going to be more stories told, and the quality of those stories, like we're going up exponentially in quality and in quantity of these stories. But as for the ones that still need to be told, there are a lot of stories about cis gay white men. And I think that's really just because there are a lot of cis white men in the media, or just in media in general. And so I think the stories that need to be told are the people who have been othered further. You need to look more at intersectionality when it comes to these kinds of stories.
I think at its simplest, we need more stories about queer representation. I think we need a variety of stories. We need stories about rich queers and poor queers and happy queers and sad queers, and I think having a plurality of queer representation on screen is the key to understanding that queer culture is full of different experiences.
I think what we found out is that young audiences are so excited and enthusiastic about queer stories and stories about identity and stories about a point of difference. So it's not about the mainstream anymore, and I think that's so good, because the mainstream can adopt stories that are kind of cutting against that sentiment.
I do think that the people who are in charge of whether things get made or not, I think they are catching on that queer stories are important, and they are wanted, and there is an audience for them, for all of them.
Thank you so much for watching Heartstopped, and I hope you found this event enlightening. Please do share your thoughts in the comments section, give us a like, and check out some other amazing LFF for free content available on this channel. Thank you to our wonderful panellists for joining me on this project, and goodbye.